Imagine a seemingly perfect couple, a pillar of their community, vanished overnight, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a town in shock. This is the story of Spencer and Monique Tepe and what really happened in Columbus. The screen is pitch black. The silence is broken by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a telephone ringing. A click, and then the raw, high-intensity audio of a 911 dispatcher fills the room. A woman's voice, breathless and fragmented, gasps out an address in a quiet Columbus suburb. In the background, there is a heavy, rhythmic thudding, the sound of someone struggling for air. The audio is visceral, capturing the exact moment a domestic sanctuary turned into a forensic site. Before we continue with this chilling story, we would like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. In the early morning hours of a quiet Tuesday in 2017, the silence of a prestigious Columbus neighborhood was shattered by a single desperate call for help. This was the moment the world first encountered the case of Spencer and Monique Tepe. It wasn't a slow build, it was an instantaneous transition from a peaceful suburban night to a high-stakes emergency. The audio from that 911 call remains one of the most difficult pieces of evidence to process, a raw recording of a woman claiming that her life was in immediate danger and a husband whose ability to speak had already been taken from him. When the first responders arrived at the Tepe residence, they didn't find the orderly, beautiful home often seen in the couple's social media posts. Instead, they walked into a scene of absolute chaos. The air was thick with the scent of copper, and the master bedroom had been transformed into a landscape of struggle. Furniture was displaced, personal items were scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all was Spencer Tepe. He was critically injured, clinging to life by a thread that was becoming thinner with every passing second. The medical teams worked with frantic precision, attempting to stabilize a man whose injuries suggested a confrontation of extreme intensity. While they fought to save Spencer, the Columbus police officers began the process of securing the scene. They found Monique Tepe nearby. She was not the composed, charitable figure the community knew. She was a woman in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, her clothes disheveled, her voice a hollow shell of its usual self.
It was here, in the flickering light of emergency vehicles, that Monique gave her initial statements. Her first account to the police was a story of a domestic dispute that had escalated beyond anyone's control. She described a night that had begun with tension and ended in a desperate physical struggle. She spoke of fear, of a sudden shift in the atmosphere of their home, and of a moment where she felt she had no choice but to act to protect herself. Her narrative was one of a domestic sanctuary that had failed, forcing her into a position she never imagined. As Spencer was rushed to the hospital and the yellow crime scene tape was unspooled across the manicured lawn, the stakes of the investigation became clear. This was no longer just an emergency, it was a legal and moral crossroads. The central question that would define the next several years of legal proceedings began to form. Was this an act of desperate self-defense? A woman fighting for her life in a moment of absolute terror? Or was this a calculated move, a meticulously planned event disguised as a spontaneous tragedy? The community of Columbus looked on in disbelief as the details began to leak out. How could a couple who represented the very height of suburban success find themselves in the middle of a forensic investigation? The 911 call was the first clue, but as investigators began to peel back the layers of the Tepe marriage, they realized that the high-intensity audio was only the beginning of a much larger, much more complex story. The struggle in the bedroom was over, but the struggle for the truth was just beginning.
To the residents of their affluent Columbus neighborhood, the Tepes were not just neighbors, they were an aspirational standard. To understand how a night of such finality could occur, one must first examine the background of a partnership that for over a decade appeared to be the bedrock of their social circle. Spencer and Monique's history began like a classic success story. They met in a setting that mirrored their shared ambitions, two young professionals with a drive that matched the fast-paced growth of the Ohio capital. Spencer was known for his sharp business mind, a man who navigated the complexities of the corporate world with a steady hand. Monique, conversely, was the heart of their public identity. She was a woman of boundless energy, a beloved figure in local charities and school boards. Together, they formed a professional and personal alliance that seemed unbreakable. Their reputation in the Columbus community was built on a foundation of involvement and generosity. If there was a fundraiser for a local hospital or a committee for a community park, the Tepe name was often at the top of the list. They weren't just living the American dream, they were its primary ambassadors in Central Ohio. This public image was what many call the facade. In the years leading up to 2017, neighbors and friends would describe a seemingly happy marriage, one characterized by mutual respect and shared goals. They were the couple who hosted the most elegant holiday gatherings, where the laughter seemed genuine and the hospitality was effortless. There were no raised voices heard through the walls of their beautiful suburban home, no public disagreements at the country club, and no visible cracks in their united front. Their social media presence was a curated gallery of milestones, anniversaries celebrated in distant locales, quiet evenings by the fireplace, and the steady progression of a life well lived. To the outside observer, the Tepes possessed a rare kind of stability, a harmony that felt both earned and permanent. However, as investigators would later discover, the transition from this public perfection to private desperation was already underway. They began to explore the undercurrents, the invisible forces that were exerting pressure on the household long before the emergency call was placed. By early 2017, the financial and personal pressures were mounting behind closed doors. Despite their outward appearance of wealth, the complexities of Spencer's business ventures had led to a delicate economic balance. Maintaining the lifestyle expected of a power couple in Columbus required a constant, exhausting stream of revenue, and any fluctuation in the market felt like a tremor in the foundation of their home. Personal pressures were equally heavy. The expectation of perfection is a weight that few can carry indefinitely. Friends noted that Monique had become increasingly meticulous about their public image, a sign that she was perhaps working harder to compensate for a reality that was no longer meeting her standards. Behind the scenes, the professional success that once fueled their partnership had become a source of competition and silent resentment. The shared goals that once unified them were being replaced by individual anxieties about their status and their future. This led to what forensic sociologists refer to as the shadow, the early signs of marital strife that remained hidden from their social circle. While they continued to appear at galas hand in hand, the atmosphere within their home had shifted. There were reports of long silences that stretched across the dinner table and a growing emotional distance that neither seemed able to bridge. These were not the explosive arguments that draw the attention of neighbors. These were the quiet, steady erosions of trust. Small, seemingly insignificant details began to surface in the post-event interviews. A coldness in a brief exchange at a grocery store, a look of exhaustion that vanished the moment a camera was pointed in their direction, a tendency for Spencer to stay later at the office while Monique immersed herself deeper into her volunteer work. These were the symptoms of a partnership in distress, yet because they were so adept at maintaining their public roles, no one in Columbus suspected that the house on the corner was anything other than a sanctuary. The community's refusal to see the cracks was not a failure of observation, but a testament to how well the Tepes performed their roles. In a society that values the appearance of success, Spencer and Monique were the ultimate performers. They understood that their social standing was tied to their perceived happiness, and so they protected that perception with a fierce, almost desperate dedication. As we look back at the months leading up to 2017, the tragedy feels less like a sudden break and more like the inevitable conclusion of a narrative that had no room for failure. The financial strain, the professional envy, and the emotional isolation had created a reality where something had to give. The perfect couple was a beautiful glass sculpture that had been under pressure for too long, and on that quiet morning in October, the pressure finally reached its limit. The world saw the shattered pieces, but it would take a meticulous investigation to understand the forces that caused the break.
When the sun set over Columbus on that final evening, nothing in the atmospheric data suggested that the equilibrium of the Tepe household was about to reach a breaking point. To understand the reality of what occurred, investigators had to move beyond the emotional accounts and build a timeline based on the objective footprints of modern life. By cross-referencing GPS data, cellular pings, and the testimonies of neighbors who observed the house from the exterior, a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the evening began to take shape. The evening had begun with a standard professional engagement. Phone records indicate that Spencer was active on his devices until approximately 6:45 p.m., closing out business matters that had occupied his afternoon. Neighbors reported seeing the couple's vehicles in the driveway by 7:15 p.m. For the next several hours, the house remained quiet. There were no reports of shouting, no unusual vehicles, and no signs of distress visible from the street. However, the digital record tells a story of increasing internal activity. Between 9 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., the movement of mobile devices within the home suggests a lack of rest, a period of transition where the inhabitants were moving between the kitchen and the master suite with unusual frequency. By midnight, the residents appeared to be at rest, but the physical reality within the walls was far different. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the peaceful status of the home ended. This was the start of the altercation. Analyzing the physical evidence in the master bedroom revealed a confrontation that was both concentrated and intense. Unlike a struggle that moves through multiple rooms, the evidence was contained almost entirely within the primary suite. This concentration suggested that the conflict was not a chase, but a stationary and rapid escalation. The master bedroom, usually a place of reprieve, had become a site of significant mechanical force. Investigators noted a heavy nightstand that had been overturned, its contents scattered in a way that suggested a sudden lateral impact. The bedding was significantly displaced, and the presence of void patterns, areas where blood spatter is blocked by an object or person, indicated that multiple parties were in close proximity during the most critical moments of the struggle. This is where forensic mapping became the primary tool for the investigation. Technicians used 3D laser scanners to create a perfect digital twin of the room, allowing them to calculate the exact angles of every mark and the trajectory of every movement. The mapping revealed a story of a struggle that began near the foot of the bed and moved toward the secondary entrance of the suite. The sheer amount of force required to damage the drywall and displace heavy furniture suggested a physical engagement that exceeded a simple scuffle. As the digital map was compared against the statements provided on the night of the event, the first discrepancies began to appear. Identifying the first inconsistencies between the physical evidence and the initial statements was a turning point for the Columbus investigators. Monique had initially described a scenario where she was backed into a corner, acting from a position of total disadvantage. However, the forensic mapping of the blood spatter and the placement of the weapon suggested a different spatial arrangement. For example, the primary impact zone, the area where the most significant force was applied, was located in an open area of the room, not near the walls or corners where a person seeking to escape would typically be found. Furthermore, the angle of the injuries sustained by Spencer did not align with a person who was crouched or defensive. The trajectory of the force appeared to be downward and deliberate rather than upward and reactive. Another significant inconsistency involved the timeline of the struggle itself. Monique's account suggested a very brief, explosive moment of violence, yet the forensic analysis of the scene revealed staged elements, items that appeared to be moved after the fact to create a specific visual impression. Smears in the blood patterns indicated that certain objects had been shifted minutes after the primary event, a detail that contradicted the claim of a person who was too shocked to move. These discrepancies did not immediately prove a specific intent, but they did suggest that the narrative provided to first responders was incomplete. The physical evidence was speaking a language of its own, one that did not perfectly match the story of a spontaneous, desperate act of self-defense. The master bedroom, once a symbol of the couple's private success, had become a complex puzzle of physics and biology. Every displaced lamp and every mark on the wall was a data point that investigators had to reconcile. As the morning light hit the Columbus suburbs, the forensic teams were left with a stark reality. The perfect picture had been replaced by a map of a struggle that the current explanation could not fully account for. The investigation was no longer looking for a missing couple. They were looking for the truth behind a violent encounter that had been meticulously analyzed but remained fundamentally unexplained.
While the forensic teams were still processing the master suite, the investigation moved to its most critical phase, the physical examination of the primary victim. The autopsy provided the first definitive data points that moved the case beyond mere speculation. Results from the coroner's office regarding Spencer's injuries revealed a complex and high-intensity engagement. The medical examiner noted that the trajectory of the wounds was not consistent with a chaotic, flailing struggle. Instead, they showed a pattern of concentrated, purposeful force. Most significant was the path of the primary injuries. The trajectory suggested that the force was delivered from a position of physical advantage, moving downward at a sharp angle. This specific detail was a direct challenge to the theory of a reactive, defensive struggle. If Spencer had been the primary aggressor in a physical confrontation, the coroner would have expected to see defensive wounds on his hands or forearms, signs that he was attempting to ward off an attack. Instead, the autopsy revealed a lack of such markers on Spencer, while simultaneously identifying injuries that suggested he was immobilized or caught by surprise during the initial moments of the event. Simultaneously, the lab began the analysis of ballistics and tool marks. Analyzing the weapon used, a firearm that Monique claimed she had been forced to use in the heat of the moment, provided additional forensic signatures. Technicians examined the shell casings and the impact points within the room, looking for the fingerprint of the mechanical action. They found that the weapon had been discharged in a rhythmic, controlled sequence. This was not the erratic firing pattern often associated with a person in a state of blind panic. Furthermore, the tool mark analysis on the bedroom furniture revealed that some of the damage to the room had been created by an object other than the struggle itself. A specific set of marks on the heavy nightstand did not match the impact of a human body, but rather the deliberate application of a metal tool used to pry the drawer open. This suggested that the robbery elements of the scene might have been an afterthought, a mechanical addition to a narrative that was being constructed in the minutes following the struggle. These findings led to the turning point in the investigation. By the third day, the evidence was no longer aligning with the story of a domestic tragedy that escalated beyond control. The moment the Columbus Police Department transitioned the case from a suspicious death to a formal homicide investigation was marked by a shift in their engagement with Monique. They were no longer treating her as a grieving witness, but as a person of interest whose account of the night was fundamentally at odds with the physical laws of the room. The inconsistencies were now too numerous to ignore.
The downward trajectory of the force, the controlled ballistics, the staged tool marks, and the digital footprint that suggested activity long after the time she claimed to be incapacitated. The department's specialized homicide unit took over the case, bringing in analysts who looked at the Tepe's life not through the lens of community standing, but through the cold reality of forensic physics. Finally, the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion. The charge was handed down, and Monique Tepe was formally taken into custody. The news sent shockwaves through her family and the wider Columbus community. For those who had seen the Tepes as the perfect couple, the arrest was an impossible reality. Her family released statements of unwavering support, insisting that the legal system would eventually validate her claim of self-defense. But for the investigators, the arrest was merely the first step in a long process of deconstructing a facade that had been years in the making. The charge of homicide indicated that the state believed they could prove a level of intent and calculation that moved the case into a different legal category. The high society fundraisers and the beautiful suburban home were now a distant memory, replaced by the stark, unyielding walls of the Franklin County Jail. The perfect couple was now a matter of public record, and the world was left to wonder how much of their life had been a performance, and how much of that performance had been designed to lead to that final, violent morning in October.
As the case of Spencer and Monique Tepe moved from the crime lab to the courtroom, the community of Columbus was presented with two fundamentally different interpretations of the same violent event. This was the moment where the data collected in the master bedroom met the complexity of human psychology. We were no longer just looking at a timeline, we were looking at the construction of two competing realities. The prosecution's theory, the economic solution. The state's case was built on a foundation of logic and cold financial reality. The prosecution's theory focused on a narrative of professional envy and an acute financial motive. To the state, the Tepes were not a couple in a domestic crisis, but two individuals locked in a deteriorating business arrangement. They argued that the act was a deliberate, final solution to a crumbling marriage that had become an economic liability. The prosecution presented evidence that Spencer's recent business ventures had put the couple's lifestyle at risk. They argued that Monique, whose identity was deeply tied to her community standing and charitable influence, saw the impending financial collapse as a social death sentence. In their view, the altercation was not a spontaneous outburst, but a way to exit a failing partnership while maintaining the financial benefits of Spencer's life insurance and the victim status that would protect her reputation. They painted a picture of a woman who viewed her husband not as a partner, but as a variable that needed to be removed to balance the equation of her life. The defense's theory, the internal struggle. Across the aisle, the narrative was diametrically opposed. The defense's theory presented a narrative of the battered woman syndrome, arguing that the perfect couple facade was a shield Monique used to hide years of quiet internal suffering. They contended that Monique acted out of an immediate, absolute fear for her life during a moment of crisis that the public never saw coming. According to the defense, the high society events and the smiling portraits were a performance Monique was forced to maintain under the weight of Spencer's controlling behavior. They argued that the financial pressures cited by the prosecution were actually the catalyst for Spencer's aggression, not Monique's calculation. In this version of the truth, the night in question was the culmination of years of emotional and psychological pressure. The defense aimed to show the jury that the woman they saw in court was a survivor who had been pushed to a psychological breaking point, acting only when she believed there was no other way to ensure her own survival. The evidence duel, blood and biology. The trial soon became what many observers called the evidence duel, a technical battle between expert witnesses who looked at the same physical marks and reached opposite conclusions. The focus was a meticulous comparison of expert testimonies on blood spatter and defensive wounds. The
The prosecution's experts pointed to the cast-off patterns on the ceiling and walls. They argued that the height and angle of these patterns suggested an aggressor who was standing tall and applying force with a high degree of confidence and momentum. They noted the lack of injuries on Monique as proof that there was no struggle, only an execution. The defense's experts countered by analyzing the transfer patterns on Monique's clothing and skin. They argued that the presence of certain bruises, which the prosecution called staged, were actually consistent with a person who had been grabbed and shaken. They focused on the void patterns in the room, suggesting that these gaps in the blood spatter proved Monique was in a defensive, crouched position during the confrontation. This duel moved into the realm of forensic biology. The state argued that the trajectory of the injuries was too perfect, suggesting a lack of the chaotic movement one would expect in a life-or-death struggle. The defense responded by bringing in psychologists to testify about the freeze response, explaining why a victim might appear to act with a terrifying mechanical precision when their life is on the line. As the testimony continued, the citizens of Columbus were forced to decide which version of the perfect couple they believed. Was Monique the architect of a cold-blooded financial plan, or was she the survivor of a hidden domestic catastrophe? The evidence was a mirror. It showed whichever narrative the observer was prepared to see. The court was no longer just weighing a crime, it was weighing the validity of two lives that had been lived entirely in the public eye, yet remained fundamentally unknown.
The courtroom in Franklin County became the final stage for a drama that had captivated the public for months. As the proceedings commenced, the focus moved away from physical maps of the home and toward the emotional and psychological architecture of the Tepe marriage. The trial was not merely a presentation of facts, but a deeply personal contest of perspectives, fueled by the accounts of key witnesses who had occupied the inner circle of the couple's life. Spencer's family members took the stand first. Their testimony was a powerful eulogy for a man they described as a dedicated provider and a stabilizing force. They spoke of his professional drive not as a source of friction, but as a commitment to his family's future. Conversely, Monique's confidants provided a starkly different narrative. They described a woman who, in private moments, appeared increasingly burdened by the expectations of her life. These friends spoke of subtle changes, a withdrawal from social activities, a quietness that felt out of character, and a growing preoccupation with keeping things together. This conflicting testimony created a picture of a household where two different versions of reality were existing simultaneously, depending on which side of the family was looking through the window. The center of the trial, however, was not what others said, but what Monique herself had revealed in the hours following the event. The prosecution played the interrogation tapes, allowing the jury to observe hours of footage from the police interview room. Analysts were brought in to conduct a minute-by-hour examination of Monique's body language and verbal cues. The jury watched as she sat under the fluorescent lights, her movements oscillating between absolute stillness and sudden sharp gestures. Experts pointed to her verbal cues, the specific way she structured her sentences, often referring to herself and Spencer in the third person, as if she were a spectator to the night's events. The prosecution argued that her lack of a visible emotional release was a sign of calculation. The defense countered by explaining that a person in the immediate wake of a life-altering trauma often experiences a state of emotional shock, where the body's primary objective is simply to remain upright and coherent. To interpret these tapes, the court turned to the field of forensic psychology. This discipline provided a framework for understanding the intent behind the actions. The primary question was whether Monique's behavior aligned with a reactive response to a threat or a proactive execution of a plan. Psychologists examined her history and her daily routines, looking for markers of over-controlled hostility, a trait where an individual maintains a perfect exterior until a specific pressure point is reached. They also explored the concept of cognitive distortion, where a person's perception of a threat becomes so heightened that their response, while appearing excessive to an outsider, feels like a necessary requirement for survival to the person involved. The jury was presented with complex data on how the brain processes fear, comparing the fight or flight response to a more calculated predatory mindset. This led to what legal analysts called the jury's dilemma. In most cases, there is an abundance of outside evidence or multiple witnesses to provide a consensus, but in this instance, the jury was faced with the ultimate difficulty, proving intent in a room where only 2 people were present and only one survived to tell the story. The jurors had to decide if the physical evidence, the downward trajectory of the force, and the staged elements of the room outweighed the psychological narrative of a woman who claimed she was pushed to the edge. They had to navigate a sea of expert opinions where for every forensic finding there was a psychological explanation. The dilemma was rooted in the limitations of human knowledge. We can map the blood on the walls and the placement of the furniture, but we cannot truly map the internal landscape of a mind in a moment of crisis. The deliberation was expected to be long and difficult. The citizens of Columbus were not just deciding the fate of Monique Tepe, they were deciding which version of the American dream they believed in, the one that succeeds through hard work and partnership, or the one that can be used as a mask for a struggle that no one else can see. As the jury retreated to the deliberation room, the silence in the courthouse was a reminder that the most important part of the story was the part that remained unspoken, hidden in the silence of a master bedroom in the early hours of a Tuesday morning.
After weeks of testimony, the fate of the perfect couple moved into a small, secluded room. The deliberation was a grueling process, as 12 citizens of Columbus were tasked with reconciling 2 irreconcilable realities. Inside that room, the jury had to weigh the powerful emotional self-defense claim against the cold, unyielding forensic evidence. They revisited the 911 audio, listening for the cadence of the breathing and the timing of the gasps. They pored over the 3D laser scans of the master bedroom, debating whether a nightstand could truly be overturned in the way Monique described. The debate was centered on the concept of reasonable doubt. For some jurors, the lack of defensive wounds on Spencer was an insurmountable fact that pointed toward a proactive act. For others, the expert testimony regarding the psychological freeze response offered a plausible explanation for the mechanical nature of the events. The 12 individuals had to navigate the space between what was physically possible and what was psychologically probable. Hour after hour, they reconstructed the struggle, testing the state's theory of financial calculation against the defense's narrative of a hidden domestic crisis. They were not just judging a crime, they were attempting to peer through the facade that had successfully fooled the entire community for over a decade. The tension reached its peak when the jury finally signaled they had reached a conclusion. The judgment was delivered in a courtroom packed to capacity, the air heavy with a shared breath. When the clerk read the verdict, the emotional reaction from both sides of the gallery was immediate and visceral. One side of the room collapsed into a state of vocal grief, while the other remained frozen in a state of stunned disbelief. Monique herself remained remarkably still, a final echo of the composure she had maintained throughout the trial. The verdict was the official end of the perfect couple narrative, replacing the curated images of their life with a permanent legal record of the events of that Tuesday morning. Following the verdict, the proceedings transitioned to the judge's words.
During the sentencing phase, the judge provided a thorough breakdown of the reasoning that guided the court's final decision. The judge spoke at length about the sanctity of the home and the tragedy of a partnership that ends in violence. In the sentencing memorandum, several key legal precedents were cited, specifically those involving the duty to retreat and the proportional use of force in domestic settings. The judge addressed the staged elements of the crime scene that the forensic teams had identified, noting that these actions suggested a level of presence of mind that was difficult to reconcile with a state of pure, reactive terror. The court acknowledged the complexity of the battered woman syndrome defense, but ultimately pointed to the forensic trajectory and the digital timeline as the most objective truths available. The sentencing was not just a punishment, but a formal statement on the responsibility individuals have to resolve conflicts without resorting to final, irreversible measures. This brings us to the final terms. Monique Tepe's journey from a beloved community figure to an inmate within the Ohio correctional system was finalized. Her fate was sealed within a high-security facility, a world away from the manicured lawns and charitable galas of her previous life. The legal system had provided a resolution, but it could not provide a restoration. Monique's life is now defined by the rigid schedules and sterile environments of the state's penal system. Her appeals process would continue for years, but the initial judgment stood as a monument to the events in that master bedroom. The community of Columbus was left to process the fact that their pillars had crumbled, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a cautionary tale about the distance between the lives we show the world and the lives we live behind closed doors. The story of Spencer and Monique Tepe had reached its legal conclusion, but the psychological impact on the town was only beginning to be understood.
When the legal gavel finally fell, the immediate noise of the trial began to fade, but the silence it left in its wake was filled with a new kind of intensity. The legacy of the case permeated the local culture, fundamentally altering the way the residents of Columbus viewed their community and the institutions designed to protect it. For years, the Tepes had been the golden standard of suburban success, and their fall necessitated a profound re-evaluation of social safety nets. Local conversations about domestic advocacy underwent a significant transformation. Before the events of 2017, the prevailing assumption was that domestic crises were visible, loud, and restricted to certain socioeconomic brackets. The Tepe tragedy dismantled this misconception, proving that the most intense struggles can occur behind the most expensive doors. Advocacy groups in Ohio saw a surge in interest and funding as the public began to understand that the perfect couple facade could be a barrier to intervention. Furthermore, the legal definition of self-defense became a primary topic of debate in law schools across the state. The case highlighted the immense difficulty the legal system faces when forced to reconcile psychological theories like battered woman syndrome with physical forensic data. While the community grappled with these broad social shifts, a much more intimate struggle was occurring within the families. For the Tepes' relatives, there was no clear path to moving forward or finding closure. Spencer's family was left to reconcile their memories of a successful, driven man with the forensic reality presented in court. They have spent the intervening years dedicated to preserving his professional legacy while quietly navigating the grief of a loss that was played out on a public stage. Monique's family, conversely, remained in a state of suspended animation. Their belief in her narrative of survival meant that they viewed the justice system not as a provider of resolution, but as an additional source of trauma. The two families, once joined by marriage and shared celebrations, became two separate islands of sorrow, divided by a master bedroom that neither side could ever truly leave behind. Closure, in this case, proved to be an elusive concept, a horizon that seemed to move further away the more the families tried to reach it. Even today, years after the sentencing, the case is haunted by unanswered questions. Despite the thousands of pages of court transcripts and the hours of expert testimony, a segment of the public remains unsatisfied. There are lingering theories that suggest neither side ever told the full story of what happened in that house. These theories often focus on the period of time between the initial altercation and the 911 call, the lost hour, where digital activity was high, but the narrative was silent. Some observers point to the financial records that were never fully unsealed, suggesting that the professional pressures were even more severe than the prosecution claimed. Others wonder if the battered woman narrative utilized by the defense was a simplified version of a much more complex, mutually destructive dynamic that had been growing for decades. These questions persist because human beings have a natural aversion to ambiguity. We want a clear villain and a clear victim, yet the Tepe case offers only a mirror of our own inability to truly know the private lives of others. The perfect picture has been permanently replaced by a mosaic of forensic facts and psychological theories. Columbus is a city that has moved on in many ways, but the Tepe name remains a shorthand for the dangers of the facade. The case serves as a permanent reminder that the stability we see in our neighbors is often a curated performance, and that the truth is rarely as clean as the lawns of a quiet suburb. As we look at the empty Tepe house today, we are reminded that while the law can provide a verdict, it cannot always provide an explanation. The why remains locked in the past, a silent witness to a night that changed a city's perception of itself forever. As we close the file on the case of Spencer and Monique Tepe, we are forced to move beyond the courtroom transcripts and forensic maps to confront the lesson left in the wake of this tragedy. This story is, at its core, a meditation on the facade of perfection that so many of us work tirelessly to maintain. The Tepes were the ultimate architects of their own public image, building a life that was admired by an entire city. But that image became a prison, a structure so rigid that it left no room for vulnerability, failure, or the healthy resolution of conflict. The tragedy in Columbus serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of community intervention. In a world where we are often taught to mind our own business and respect the privacy of the perfect family next door, we must learn to recognize the subtle markers of distress that exist beneath the surface. True community is not found in shared galas or polite waves across a manicured lawn. It is found in the courage to ask difficult questions and the willingness to offer support before a situation reaches a point of no return. The Tepe case teaches us that silence is rarely a sign of peace. Often, it is simply the sound of a struggle that has no outlet. While the legal system has provided us with the how, the trajectories of force, the digital timestamps, and the mechanical sequence of events, we must arrive at a difficult acknowledgement regarding the why. The court was able to prove a sequence of actions, and it was able to establish a legal verdict of intent. However, the internal why, the exact moment the heart of that marriage stopped beating and was replaced by a cold survivalist calculation, remains locked away. That fundamental truth is held only in the memory of the survivor. We can analyze the financial pressures and the professional envy until we have exhausted every data point, but the human element remains a shadow. Was it a single moment of explosive realization, or was it the steady, quiet accumulation of 1,000 small resentments? We may never know the specific spark that transformed a suburban bedroom into a forensic site. This is the lingering frustration of true crime. The law can provide a resolution, but it cannot always provide an understanding. We are left to piece together a narrative from the fragments left behind, knowing that the most critical piece of the puzzle is one we can never touch. The story of Spencer and Monique Tepe is a cautionary tale for the modern age. It is a reminder that the lives we see through the glass of social media and the filters of public reputation are only a fraction of the reality. Behind every perfect couple is a human story, filled with the same complexities, fears, and pressures that affect us all. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what really happened in Columbus. This has been a production of Cold Case Reviews. If you found this analysis of the Tepe case insightful, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the cases that defy easy explanation. We are dedicated to uncovering the truth behind the headlines and exploring the psychology that drives the unthinkable. Comment below. We want to hear from you. After seeing the breakdown of the bedroom mapping and the autopsy findings, did the forensic evidence convince you of the prosecution's theory, or do you believe this was truly a self-defense born from a hidden struggle? Is a perfect facade enough to hide a person's true nature, or do the cracks always show if you know where to look? Until next time, look a little closer at the world around you, stay curious, and stay safe.